Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to not to put extend the discussion on when you can put a credit freeze on or put a lock on. It's interesting you said Mr. Smith, you said you can put a lock on after you've been a victim of identity theft. That's kind of like saying, lock the door after the thief went in your house. I mean, it's just not, it's not responsive to what we're trying to get at here, which is we understand the benefit of an aggregator of data that gives us easier access to credit. I think no one's disagreeing with that. The question is, and you were asked about fiduciary obligations, and the question really is, what responsibility does that aggregator have when something like this happens? Now, when Mr. Smith was here, the previous Mr. Smith, Equifax.
No relation.
Yeah, I figured that. He said this happens all the time. We're hit all the time. And I asked, well, in light of that, then why did you seem so ill-prepared when you were actually breached? Why did it take you so long to come up with a response to the breach? So I've got a series of questions on how often does this happen, and what is the general response that the industry has. So, as a general matter, how many times per year, on average, would a company like Equifax, TransUnion, or Experian how often would you experience a breach that would be reported to the FBI?
So, unfortunately, I don't have those figures. We can find them. I would say that, based on my personal knowledge, that none of the credit bureaus themselves have been breached. Now, the companies, in Equifax's case, it was information that was outside of the Consumer Reporting Agency database. We also know of a breach at Experian involving data of T-Mobile. So there are breaches that occur, and we'll come up with a number for how frequently they occur, but to the best of my knowledge, there has never been a security breach of a Consumer Reporting Agency database.
Yeah, and that's splitting a hair for the consumers. I don't think there's any doubt about it.
Well, but it's an important policy point, I think, because if the FTC and CFPB, after their investigations, conclude that the Consumer Reporting Agency database wasn't breached after Equifax was subjected to this punishing attack, that might inform our policy choices.
The next question I have is, after, let's say that you reported to the FBI, what is the typical guidelines or strategies that any of these credit agencies, that any of them would basically go to? Do you have like a fire drill, in other words?
Well,
do you have a system in place that will lock down and protect data?
Right. So now, of course, I can't speak for any particular company, but the companies with which I'm familiar have incident response plans, and they've done they call it a tabletop exercise, where all the stakeholders are around the table, and we run through what's the public statement going to be, what are we going to do with respect to our call centers, how do we inform law enforcement, how are we going to do the consumer notifications, that kind of stuff.
But you'd have to agree that Equifax was pretty ill-prepared.
I don't know. I think this was an unprecedented breach. So I'd rather not speak
even if it's 10 people, the response should be the same as if it were 140 million people.
Well, except think about your call center, for example. So rather than 10 calls you can handle. 140 million on one day?
Doesn't that beg the question of why people here are upset? I mean, you had Senator Kennedy basically say, look, this is not data that you own. You do not have a relationship with the consumer other than an aggregator that provides that service. If I say, I don't want your service, I'll aggregate my own data, I'll take responsibility, I have to pay you so that you aren't collecting my data, correct?
Not collecting. This is a freeze, right? The data's still there, but you've frozen it, and you have the right to unfreeze it.
In Europe, all across the EU, there's a whole lot of privacy initiatives. The right to be forgotten. We're getting close to that here. We've been a much more open economy as it relates to this kind of data aggregation, the more we do not see a response, the closer we are to that pendulum that Senator Tellis talked about, which is the potential that you guys are going to be out of business because every American is going to say, we don't want your service.
No, absolutely. We need to ensure that consumers and businesses trust the National Credit Reporting System. to
And I
protect the
think you
data.
have a serious trust problem today. And I think the lack of coming forth with solutions and the adversarial kind of approach that we've seen to this is not helping to solve the problem. So we look forward to ongoing discussions.
As do we.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.